All right. Magnus Carlsen just won. So we're going to jump right into it with this quick, brief rundown. This was a long game. So I'm just going to run through it real quick. And I'm excited. I knew he was going to tie it up. So we'll see. There's a rest day tomorrow. So this game is just going to go down in the history books as one of the great games by any world champion. It was just a fantastic game throughout, and especially with all that pressure on Magnus Carlsen's shoulders to try to win. Karjakin played. He went for that Berlin defense, and true to form, Carlsen avoided that Berlin wall and played d3. And now you get lines similar to Joko Piano, except the bishop is here instead of here on c4. And this is all well-known theory. So we're just going to move quickly through all of these moves and get to the juicy parts of the position. But suffice it to say that all of this is just equal right here for black. And but white does have pieces to play with, and Magnus Carlsen is just simply going to impose his will on the position here. So we see this knight maneuver here. I did eye these squares. In the future, just like your typical Ruy Lopez themes. In any open game, it's good to realize that with the pawn on e4, the squares f4 and for black, f5 for white and f4 for black are very important as outposts in the position. So we see basically both sides, due to the asymmetry in the position, pursuing these outposts here. And normally when a piece lands on f4 or f5, usually provokes the player to eventually have to weaken his king side by playing move like g3 or g6 to kick the piece out. So queen f6 is played, and we see that white, or black rather, is building up on the king side, and in some positions even maybe threatening knight takes g2, or if the queen were to vacate, in some lines playing knight h3. So there's some storm clouds over the position, and black has to be careful. This queen also prevents knight f4 right now, because black would simply just win the pawn here. So g3, not only kicking the knight out, but also having the ideas of playing knight d5. So therefore, Karjakin can't afford just to play a purely defensive move here, but he must do a move that's going to offset this threat of knight d5. So he plays the check. Note the bishop is here on c8, protecting the knight here on h3. And since it's check, white doesn't have time to bring his knight to d5. So king h1 is played. Knight e7. Karjakin plans on transferring his other knight over here to the king side to join in the assault against the king. And notice now the f3 square is a little weaker as a result of the knight being on f4 and provoking g3. Now this bishop is a little bit stranded and is going to need to move, because another plan black has is to expand with c6 and even d5, given opportunity. So Carlsen moves the bishop, and there it is, c6. Bishop b3. Sometimes black will also extend with moves like b5 and a5, hitting the bishop. So Carlsen just simply takes precautions against that. There's knight g6. All these moves are pretty standard and obvious. White connects his rooks. It's a5. And one of the ideas, besides just expanding on the queen side, is to drive this bishop off this diagonal. This is a strong diagonal right here. It would be nice to get the bishop to an inferior diagonal. So Carlsen stops that idea with a4. And now bishop e6. So he can't stop the bishop or drive him off the diagonal, so he simply offers to trade. So bishop takes e6, and now Karjakin opts for f takes e6. Weakens his pawn structure a little bit, but he threatens to win the knight and puts tremendous pressure down on the f file. Also playable was the natural queen takes e6, but it isn't as active. But if he wanted to play super solid and just keep everything together, queen takes e6, definitely an option. But I can't really blame him for playing f takes e6. I mean, he opens this file for the rooks, and this is all in line with standard play in open games. Is occupying the f4 square for black, opening up the f file, and attacking the opponent's king. And then we see here this x-ray. If this knight moves, there's even ideas of knight takes f2. So there it is. Knight d2. This pawn is here now. Now this is an important point in the game. Karjakin plays d5. Now what about knight takes f2? Now if knight f2, king g2, and now this knight really can't move due to this pin here. However, after knight h4, there's a draw here for black. Black probably can force this draw, because if g takes h4, then queen g6 check. And there's no escape here. For instance, so knight g4 would have to be played, and then just simply knight takes g4. What does that mean? That means this knight can't be captured, so the king must move. So, for instance, to g1. Now there's a checking opportunity. Check. Where else? Can't go here, can't go here. Gotta go back. Knight f2. And of course, to give up the exchange would just be losing. So, king g1. King h1. And you get the point. It's perpetual. And Karjakin could have definitely been one game closer to becoming a world champion. So let's go back to what was actually played. So knight d2, knight takes f2, definitely seems like it was the correct move there. Karjakin played d5, which is not bad in itself. It's a good move and a standard move that white wants to achieve the d5 advance in the king pawn openings. But given the match situation, it seems that if he had a forced draw, he probably should have went for it. Carlsen plays queen h5. And again, there's the same idea of knight takes f2, which is possible. He plays knight g5. Let's look at it again. Not again, but let's look at it with the queen over here on h5 now. If knight takes f2, king g1. Again, we see this scenario where the knight is pinned to the queen, but not really threatening to capture here. So, for instance, after a move like rook a e8 and rook a e1, Matter of fact, let's take that move back. Let's make a move that seems like it would be trying to trap this knight. So, for instance, like knight d1 here. So now after knight d1, we can see the knight on d1 and the rook threatening to capture this piece. But here, black has a good move. Queen g5, threatening this knight here and the queen. So, queen takes g5, and now, check it out. The old-fashioned fork. And that rescues the knight out of its situation. After king g2, just simply knight takes g5. And then black is a little better there. Complicated lines, and I'm sure the players Karjakin overlooked. He probably looked at knight f2 and rejected it on account of this looking like the knight was pinned. But there's some tactical nuances that allows him to extract the piece. So knight g5 was played. And the idea is real simple, and it's just to settle into f4. So there's h4 by Magnus. And knight f3. Knight f3. Queen takes, forcing the trade of queens. So if you're Karjakin, you figure you're headed straight toward the promised land, which is in his case a draw. King g2. And he simply goes back to rook f7. So things seem to be under control. There's these double pawns, which at this point are only potential weakness. You know, a weakness on paper, but not in practice as of yet. Rook fe1 by Magnus. And here we see a lot of shuffling. But some of the major point of it is Magnus is lining up against these double pawns here. In the perfect world, he would like to eliminate his e-pawn, capture somehow, have his rooks doubled up, along with his knight on the good square, possibly f3, and win one or two of these double pawns on the e-file. So the next few moves have that idea in mind, with black defending and white trying to provoke some weakness. So h5 is played because white will play h5 and drive the knight from the defense of this pawn. So knight f1, what's going on with that? Well, Magnus is simply repositioning his knight to put it on f3 to attack this pawn. Now we see this pawn is weakly defended by the king here. So we will see this type of thing going on where the rook goes to f8, doubles up, and Magnus will play rook e2 to defend and possibly bring this rook over. Notice the defense. Sorry about all the graphics. Notice the defense and attack going on at the same time. Okay, so there's knight f1, king f8, knight d2. Again, the knight is going here. King e7. So we see Karjakin defending. He understands his weaknesses in a position and his potential weaknesses, so he goes close to these weaknesses to defend them. Rook e2. Of course, Magnus sees the potential. Notice how these grandmasters nip certain problems in the bud before they actually become a problem. They don't wait till they're attacked and then start defending. They see the potential ahead of time, and they just defend. They shore that up. Again, king d6. So now we see the king in excellent position. The king is in the central. This is Russian chess right here by Karjakin. The king is in the center of the board, protecting the weakness, but not in the way of any of the other pieces. So there's knight f3. So now we see pressure there and the idea to jump there if need be. So this knight is very important in this position, and the knights are very important in closed positions in general. Doubling up and not defending but attacking the knight on f3 here. Magnus counterattacks. And what I like about this sequence is that Magnus has forced the rook to a passive square. So now it's passively defending. And this is a major theme that goes on throughout the rest of this game, is Magnus forcing his opponent's pieces to inferior squares. Okay, now Magnus doubles up. Of course, like I said, in a perfect world, he would like to have this pawn eliminated and then attack these double pawns. So the rooks double up. More pressure here. And a little cat and mouse game. Knight h8. So now we see Karjakin repositioning his knight here. And we see more attack against these pawns. E takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight is in an excellent position because if any type of move like that, c5, the knight has an excellent outpost here on b5. And the same with the move like e5, there's an excellent outpost on f5. And it would be check in this instance. So there's g6. And of course, the moment of truth is here because now black would like to display e5 here. And now the knight doesn't have this square anymore. So, rook e3. Knight f7. Let's look at this. Now if e5 here, then we have knight f3 here. And basically what's going to happen is eventually this pawn is going to be all alone once this pawn captures on d5. So knight f7 is played. e5. So Magnus makes a committal decision here, is he shuts down all of these pieces with that move, e5, and creates a wedge and a position. He also preserves his knight on d4 because e5 was the only way that black could get rid of that knight on d4. Like I said, if c5 is played, the knight has an excellent outpost, and it'd be very difficult to get rid of that knight out of b5. So for all intents and purposes, black's pawns are frozen, because to make any pawn moves would be to create weakness in the position. This goes back to our theme of blockade that I spoke about yesterday. This knight being in front of this d pawn, knight being on d4, blocking the d pawn, exerts great power in the position by covering these squares. This is why the knight is the best blockader, because the knight is the only piece. The knight is the only piece that can actually jump over other pieces and pawns, and therefore the knight is able to exert influence on squares where no other piece would be able to do it. If you put the rook on d4, that rook is pretty much shut down as far as exerting force into black's side of the board, or bishop, or any other piece. But the knight is able to exert influence. king d7. And now we see the rook coming off this blocked file that's no longer useful and switching to the F file. What's the idea? To penetrate into the position. This pawn is weak. This pawn is already attacked once by the knight. Simply to play rook f6 and start attacking laterally. Meanwhile, this rook is here protecting the e5 pawn from the attack of this knight. What's the idea here? Well, we don't want white to penetrate, so the knight wants to block that with f5, with knight f5, excuse me. Carlsen says, gotcha, too late. So now this pawn has to be defended. Okay, there it is, rook g7. And now he's all set to play knight f5 on the next move. b4, excellent move. If black is to capture, this gives white the opportunity to create an outside pass pawn. And there it is. And now that pawn has to be watched by black. Knight g8, attacking the rook. Notice also again, see how Magnus drove these rooks into passive position? Totally on the defensive. The knight drops back to f3. And now the knight returns and is ready to go to f5. So even though Magnus has some pressure on the position now, it's hard to see how he will continue. Karjakin is playing good defense. a5, taking more space on the queen side and fixing these pawns. And notice the opportunities on those squares I marked red for the knight. The knight can go to c5 or it can go to b6. So besides creating more outpost opportunities for the knight, these pawns are pretty much fixed. And fixed pawns are weak pawns. Once pawns lose their mobility, they become a liability. Remember that. So there it is. There's the blockade. So this rook cannot penetrate now. And black would love to get rid of this knight and trade it off. Now would you let that happen? No way. This knight is going right here. King c7. Again, anticipating the knight coming here with check. So knight c5 is played. Again, the blockade of this pawn on c6 allows this knight to exert great power into the black position. All these squares that the arrows are touching, these squares cannot be occupied by black pieces safely. And those pawns that are touched by the knight all have to be protected by a piece. There's no other pawn that can protect them. What does that do? It demobilizes the black army. So instead of counterattacking, he has to stay home and defend. Instead of this king, let's get rid of the graphics. Instead of the black king participating in the fight in the center, he has to stay home and defend this pawn. This rook, instead of participating in the game, has to stay home and defend the e6 pawn. And so it is the build-up and accumulation of these symptoms, weakness in the position, that cause Karjakin's game to collapse. So now we see the king on b8. You don't want the king to be there in the endgame. Remember, a few moves ago, the king was beautifully placed on d6, and now it's far away from the action. Remember, I always tell you guys that when I say you guys, I mean those that look at my other videos, right, and improve their game thereby. But I always talk about opposition, heavy pieces to the king or queen. Notice rook on b1, king on b8. You might say, well, look, there's some pawns in front of the in between. You know, what's the big deal? There's no big deal now, but there will come a time where this pawn is jettisoned, and then you have an opportunity to coordinate an attack. Magnus plays a good move. Rook b1, and again, Karjakin's no fool. He gets out of that opposition. He brings his king over here. Good safety move. Now rook to d3. Rook to c7. Again, these are like waiting moves because Karjakin can't really improve his position, and he doesn't want to make his position any worse. So he's just waiting. He's kind of in a bad state right here. He's just trying to hold basically. Rook a3, more opposition to the king, and it's getting dangerous as all type of ideas such as b4 come to mind. Excuse me, b5 come to mind. Knight d4. And here's a great move by Magnus. This is one of my favorite moves in the game, and this is where I really started to understand that black was in trouble here. Because after rook d1 attacking this knight, it looks like that Karjakin will just be able to jump into this nice outpost right here, blockading the b4 pawn. However, black's rooks are so bad here, right? They're so passively placed that if knight b5, a move that we would love to do, then simply rook f3 is almost winning. Because how do you stop the penetration of the white rook? And this is the dilemma that Karjakin had. So after rook d1, attacking the knight, he had no choice but to go back and block on the f file. So all of these pieces are passive. King h3, just getting ready. Sometimes with moves like f3 and g4 in some lines. Again, anticipating. Maybe with the ideas of trying to get these rooks involved. Of course, this rook on e8 can't go anywhere because of the pressure on the e6 pawn. There's f3. And the other rook moves to the f file. And again, I said it earlier, but notice how Magnus anticipates the attack. As soon as knight h6 is played, the purpose of clearing the f file is to bring a rook to the open file. And so he knows this pawn is going to be attacked. He doesn't wait until the pawn is attacked. He makes the defensive move ahead of time. So f3, notice how the rook here defends this pawn here. So rook f7, there's no loss of tempo. Rook d4. And notice how this rook is blockading here on d5, but doesn't have the same effect as the knight The rook's not able to reach into the black position like the knight is. Knight f5. Rook d2. And now we see some more jockeying of position here. Rook b3. And now Magnus is setting up an ideal time to play this move b4. So rook to e7. Again, this influence of this knight is very annoying for black. Rook d3 by Magnus. Rook d3. Rook h8. Rook b1. Little repetition going on. And then finally, he finds the right time and plays b7. Excuse me, b5 here. And rook takes b5. So now we see there's a lot of trouble for white. d4. And the reason why I didn't explain this, but the reason why b5 is so strong is because, again, the passive position of the rooks. There's no way to stop the simple idea of just b6 attacking along the rank. So after this, for instance, if say rook c7, then knight e6 drops. So he can't even move that rook off the e file. So he does d4. Gives rook b6. So now this pawn is going to drop. And if this knight moves back here, well, then d4 drops. So trying to counterattack from a bad position usually doesn't work, because the tactics usually will favor, or tactics do favor, the person who is better placed. What does that mean? The player whose pieces are in better positions usually have the tactics fall in their favor. So we see this move, rook c7, and just by analyzing the general, nature of the position, we can see that black is worse here, and that white is in a great position. So all he has to do is simply just take the pawn that he's been pressuring so long. So knight takes e6, and now we see the idea behind Karjakin's d4, and which is to create havoc with this passed pawn. Again, here's another simple move that solves the problem of this rook being attacked. Knight f4. Not only protecting the rook, but making a way for the pawn to advance. Notice this is also under scrutiny on g6. So finally, black gets his rooks into play. Now during the game, many analysts and engines were saying rook takes g6 is the winning move. Magnus is human. He played a human-looking move. He went for elementary tactic and played a fork. But not just to play a fork, he eliminates a pair of rooks, because the two rooks could be dangerous, perhaps create mating attacks against the king. So he lessened what he perceived as danger by forcing a pair of rooks off the board. So rook takes d3, knight takes d3. King b8, attacking the knight. And Magnus played the correct move here. And knight b5. Now this pawn is going to fall. King c8, trying to get the king in a position to be able to help stopping these passed pawns. And rook takes g6. And rook takes f3. So we see some pressure here. And now Magnus finds pretty much one of the only moves that win here. And king g2 just simply counterattacking. Karjakin challenges the knight here. And now simplification takes place. Notice there's a fork here. So this is all forced. And Magnus forces the situation and now has a winning endgame. Karjakin fights valiantly trying to draw. But this time there will be no magic in New York. Now here this endgame is pretty simple, as the E pawn and D pawn will be traded for each other. And then we see that this pawn on h5 will have to be protected by the rook. So the black rook will have to get to h7 or h6 somehow, and that will make it passive. And once that rook is passive, then white's king will be free. Let me get rid of the graphics. Then white's king will be free to enter into the kingside position, and that will seal black's fate. So let's look at how it happened. So e6, king c7, natural move, and there it is. Rook takes d4, rook takes d4, right? All fine and dandy. So far that's phase one of the plan. It's trade off black's potential for counterplay, and now rook d5 protects this pawn, attacks this pawn. Black has no choice but to protect with the rook, driving the opponent's piece to a passive square, because we all know that in rook endgames, rooks need to be active. I only see one active rook on the board, and white is in the driver's seat. He has more space, better rook, better king, and more material. So the game is, for all intents and purposes, over. King f3, just coming in with the king. Notice also the rook on the d file cuts the king off. King f4. This rook by itself cannot stop the combination of this king and rook. King a7. King g5. g4 wins also, because the h pawn can't be stopped. So for instance, g4, h takes g4, king takes g4, and then this pawn will work itself up the board. However, there's about 5 or 6 different ways to win at this point. So king g5 is just another way. And king f6. And here, Carlsen resigned. Now, I was watching the video on the Russian feed, and I thought it was kind of shady that right before, like maybe 3 or 4 moves, when it was clear that Karjakin was lost, all of a sudden the Russian video portion was no longer working. I thought that was kind of suspicious. It's like somebody said, we don't want the world to see him resigning, so they cut off the video part. So I thought that was kind of funny. It was like around move 69 or something when that happened. But anyway, Magnus Carlsen has tied up the World Championship game at the World Championship match at 1 apiece, and truly one of his great performances. And he has the black pieces, not tomorrow, but the next day, and then he has the last game is white. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Karjakin is going to bounce back now. And this goes down as one of the great games in history. He definitely needed to win this game. Some other examples of great must-win games. You could go back to the Kramnik-Liko World Championship match. Kramnik had to win the last game to retain his title. That's a good game to look at. Also, 1987, Kasparov-Karpov. Kasparov had to win, not draw, but he had to win that last game to retain his title. Also, you can go back to Lasker-Schlechter, where, again, Lasker had to win to retain his title in the last game. This is not the last game, but it was definitely close enough for me to put it in that must-win category. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Please like and subscribe, and put your comments and questions down below. And I'll see you guys on the next video.